I've lived a long life, long enough to see children grow into parents, and parents grow into the kind of elders who look back more than they look forward. At my age, memories are like old quilts, some pieces warm and comforting, others patched in from times I would rather forget, and yet they hold together to tell the truth of who I became. I wasn't always this silver-haired woman sitting in a rocking chair with a shawl around her shoulders. Once I was a young bride with hope stitched into every seam of my wedding dress. I remember standing in front of the mirror that morning, nervous and trembling, the fabric smooth under my hands, and thinking, this is it, the beginning of my new life. Tom, my husband, had eyes that were kind enough to make me believe the world could be kind too. He wasn't rich, but he belonged to a family that lived in a big ancestral house on the hill, a house people in town whispered about with awe and envy. They said it was more than a home. It was a fortress of pride, history, and power. And stepping into that house, I thought, would mean stepping into a family that would treat me as one of their own. But life has a way of teaching lessons you don't expect. When I walked through those tall wooden doors for the first time, carrying my little suitcase and my new dreams, I didn't realize I was also walking into chains. Chains you couldn't see, but chains that pulled heavy on my spirit. I can still smell the faint scent of lemon polish on the furniture, see the way light fell through the wide windows onto the marble floor, hear the soft echo of my shoes in the hall. Everything looked beautiful. But behind the beauty lived a shadow, and that shadow was the landlord's son. He wasn't my husband. He was Tom's older brother, Ethan, the one everyone called the heir. From the moment I laid eyes on him, I felt something cold, something dangerous. He didn't smile at me the way others did. He didn't offer welcome. He just looked at me, from head to toe, as though he were measuring a piece of land he already owned. And maybe, in his mind, that's exactly what I was. That day I thought marriage had given me a family. What I didn't know was that it had also delivered me into the hands of a man who believed women could be ruled, silenced, and broken like furniture. I didn't know that my life in that house would become a daily test of endurance. But I survived, not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because I learned that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, sometimes it hides in the smallest corner of your soul, until the day you need it most. So before I tell you my story, let me say this. Those who treat women like property forget one thing. Property can be broken, but a woman's spirit endures. This is the story of the landlord's son who thought he ruled our home. And the day I learned he did not rule me. I was 21 when I became a bride. 21, and still soft around the edges, with dreams that hadn't yet been tested by life's hard corners. I remember the little church where we said our vows, the way the pews creaked as neighbors leaned forward to watch. Tom stood across from me, tall and quiet. Not a man of many words, but one who carried a certain gentleness in his eyes. That gentleness is what made me trust him, what made me believe that stepping into his family's world would be stepping into safety. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, I felt like I had crossed a threshold into something sacred, something lasting. I didn't have much, just a suitcase with a few dresses, a pair of shoes my mother had polished until they looked new, and the quilt my grandmother had sewn when I was a girl. But I had hope. And in that moment, hope felt like the richest dowry a girl could bring. We rode together to his family's home after the wedding. I had never seen it up close before. The Whitaker house, the townspeople called it. Though in truth it was more a mansion than a house. It sat on a rise of land just beyond the main road, with tall oak trees guarding its long driveway and stone columns that seemed to whisper of generations gone by. To a girl who had grown up in a cottage where the roof leaked each spring, it looked like a palace. I thought, this is where my new life begins. This is where I will belong. But belonging, I soon learned, is not something a house gives you. It is something people must allow. When we walked through the wide double doors, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and wood smoke. A grand staircase stretched upward like something out of a painting. There were portraits of stern-faced men on the walls, ancestors who seemed to watch me as though measuring whether I was fit to stand there. My heart fluttered between awe and fear. Tom squeezed my hand gently, a silent reassurance. But the truth was, I was stepping into a world he himself didn't fully control. His mother came forward first, Mrs. Whitaker, tall, sharp-eyed, dressed in black even on a sunny day. She kissed Tom's cheek and looked at me with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome, my dear," she said, and her voice was polite, practiced, as though welcoming a guest who wouldn't be staying long. Then there was Aunt Claire, lips pinched tight, and a cluster of cousins whispering behind their hands, sizing me up like a stranger at market. Their glances darted over my plain dress, my nervous posture, my unpolished shoes. I told myself it was just nerves, that once they knew me, kindness would follow. And then he appeared, Ethan Whitaker, Tom's older brother, the landlord's son, as everyone called him, for he had been raised from boyhood to inherit not just the land, but the authority that came with it. He came down the staircase with the ease of someone who believed the house itself bowed to him. His jacket was slung over his shoulder, his hair neatly combed, his jaw set in that hard line of someone who had never been told no. When his eyes landed on me, they didn't soften. They didn't warm. They scanned me the way a man scans property he might one day put to use. "Tom," he said, nodding at his brother. "So this is your bride." His tone wasn't curious. It wasn't welcoming. It was dismissive, as if I were a detail, a side note. I tried to smile politely to say something that would ease the tension, but words caught in my throat. All I could do was lower my eyes, though a small unease settled in my stomach that moment and never quite left. The rest of the family treated him with the kind of deference that bordered on fear. If he spoke, they listened. If he entered the room, conversations hushed. It was clear, even to me as a newcomer, that this house had one ruler, and it wasn't my husband. The first days in the Whitaker household were nothing like the life I had imagined as a bride. I had pictured mornings shared with Tom, planning our little future, maybe planting a garden together or making our room a cozy space of our own. But the reality was far different. From the very beginning, it was made clear that my place was not beside my husband, but beneath the entire household. Up early. "Dear," Mrs. Whitaker instructed me on my very first morning. "There's breakfast to prepare, floors to sweep, linens to launder. You'll find your duties keep you busy." Duties. The word fell like a chain around my neck. I had expected to help, of course, but not to become the household servant. Yet no one corrected her. Tom only shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his hands, and I realized with a sting that his silence meant consent. From then on, my days began before dawn. I lit the fires, scrubbed the pans, carried water from the well, and served meals I rarely had time to taste. When guests came, I hovered in the background, tray in hand, pouring tea as if I were invisible. Ethan made sure I didn't forget my place. He had a way of delivering commands not as requests, but as orders. "Bring more wood for the fire," he'd say, not even looking at me. "That's crooked. Fix it," he'd snap, shifting a bowl I had set on the table. If I faltered, even slightly, he would smirk, as though my clumsiness confirmed what he already believed, that I was unworthy of the Whitaker name. The others followed his lead. Aunt Claire would shake her head disapprovingly. Cousins would giggle behind their napkins when I stumbled. And Mrs. Whitaker herself seemed to see me not as a daughter-in-law, but as a servant, whose only value was obedience. Tom remained caught between. In the quiet of our small room, he would sometimes take my hand and whisper, "I'm sorry. It's just how things are here." But in the light of day, when Ethan's voice filled the halls, my husband's lips sealed shut. He became a shadow of the man I thought I had married. Kind, yes, but paralyzed by fear of his brother's disapproval. It was in those first weeks that I learned a painful truth. In that house, I wasn't a bride. I was the servant bride, living under rules I had never agreed to, expected to bow in silence while another man, a man who wasn't even my husband, ruled over my days. Each night, when exhaustion weighed on me, I would sit by the small window in our room, looking out at the dark line of trees beyond the field, and I would whisper to myself, "Endure, just endure." I didn't know then how much that endurance would be tested. I didn't know the humiliations that awaited me, the beatings that would leave my spirit aching more than my skin. I didn't know that one day I would be forced to choose whether to bow forever or to rise, no matter the cost. But Act 1 of my life in that house, those first days, planted the truth in me, a truth I didn't yet understand, but one that would carry me through. That dignity, once taken, must someday be reclaimed. The first weeks passed with a steady rhythm of exhaustion, but it didn't take long for the rhythm to turn cruel. Ethan, the landlord's son, had a way of watching me as if I were some kind of performer in his private theater, waiting, searching, eager for the next stumble he could use to remind me that I was beneath him. The humiliations began small. At breakfast one morning, I brought out a plate of eggs I had carefully cooked, proud of how I'd managed to keep them from sticking to the pan. Ethan lifted his fork, speared one, tasted, and then set it back down with exaggerated disgust. "Dry," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. A proper cook would know better. I stood frozen, the serving spoon trembling in my hand, as the cousins exchanged knowing smirks, and Aunt Claire muttered, "She'll learn, or she won't." Another time I baked a pie, the kind my mother had taught me, with sugar sprinkled just so across the crust. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could win their approval through the language of food. But when I set it on the table, Ethan cut a slice, tasted it, and without a word shoved his plate aside. "Too sweet," he said finally. "Do it again next time." The next day he threw a roast to the floor, declaring it overcooked. Meat juices splattered across the clean tiles, and I knelt down, my cheeks burning as I wiped the mess with my apron. Laughter echoed above me. Not just his, but others. That was the part that stung most, the way cruelty became entertainment. It wasn't just the food. He found ways to twist every chore into punishment. If I swept the hallway, he'd walk through with muddy boots just to make me do it again. If I folded the linens, he'd unfold them with one careless flick, watching me start over. "You're not a bride," he said once, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're our servant. Best you remember that." Those words carved themselves into me. Each time I picked up a bucket of water or bent to scrub the floor, I heard them ringing in my ears. Not a bride. A servant. The first beating came not long after. It was a simple accident. I was carrying a tray of teacups through the parlor, nervous because guests were present. My hands were damp with sweat, and as I set one cup down, it slipped from my fingers and shattered on the polished floor. The sound was sharp, loud, impossible to hide. For a moment, silence held the room. I bent quickly to gather the pieces, my hands trembling, cheeks burning. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, desperate to mend the mistake. But Ethan was already on his feet. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and before I could rise, his hand came down across my face. The blow rang in my head like a bell. The cup shards cut into my palm as I stumbled, but I hardly felt them. My ears roared with humiliation. My body shook, not from the pain itself, but from the knowledge that it had happened in front of everyone. The cousins looked away. Aunt Claire sipped her tea as if nothing had occurred. Mrs. Whittaker merely adjusted her shawl and said, "Careless girl." And Tom, my husband, my partner, the man who had promised to protect me, sat frozen, his lips parting as though to speak, then closing again. His silence was heavier than the slap. That night, when we were finally alone, I pressed a damp cloth against my cheek and asked in a voice so small it hardly sounded like mine. "Why didn't you say anything?" Tom turned away, his shoulders hunched. "You don't understand," he muttered. "Ethan, he's always been like this. There's nothing I can do." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him, to demand that he choose me over fear. But instead I sat in silence, tears sliding down my cheeks, realizing that the man I had married was trapped, not by chains of iron, but by chains of fear. After that, Ethan's cruelty sharpened. He forbade me from visiting my parents. When I asked if I might see them just for a day, his eyes narrowed. "Why would you need to go? You have everything here." His words carried not concern but possession. He restricted even the simple dignity of food. At meals I served everyone first, then sat at the end of the table with scraps, eating only what remained after the others had finished. Hunger gnawed at me, but shame gnawed deeper. Worse still were the rumors. I overheard him once, speaking to the servants in a tone dripping with false sincerity. "She's lazy," he said. "Spends more time staring out windows than working." The words spread like wildfire, repeated in whispers until even those who might have pitied me began to believe I was what he claimed. Each insult, each restriction, each whispered lie was a thread, weaving a net designed to catch me, to hold me down. I began to feel like I was drowning inside that grand house, suffocated not by walls, but by silence. My own, and my husband's. Some nights I would lie awake, listening to the house breathe, the creak of floorboards, the distant crackle of the fire, the footsteps of servants moving in the dark. Beside me, Tom would sleep, his back turned, his breathing steady, and I would wonder if he heard the echoes of my quiet sobs, and chose not to stir, because stirring would mean admitting his failure. The pain of betrayal by silence is sharper than any slap. A bruise fades, a silence lingers. Still, some part of me refused to let go completely. Each day I rose, put on my apron, lit the fire, carried the water. Each day I told myself, endure, just endure. But endurance is not endless. A heart pushed too far will eventually break or awaken. And though I did not know it yet, the breaking point was already on its way. The breaking point did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, small humiliations stacked one atop the other, until the weight could no longer be carried in silence. It was at a family gathering when the crack first showed. Relatives from neighboring towns had come to visit, filling the grand dining room with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of silverware. I had spent hours in the kitchen preparing platters, roasting meat, arranging bread baskets. My hands were raw from kneading dough, my dress damp with sweat from leaning over the fire. When the moment came to serve, Ethan made sure I was the one carrying plates into the room. Not a servant, not a cousin, me, the bride who was supposed to be celebrated, the young wife who should have been seated beside her husband. "Bring it here," he ordered, his voice casual but sharp enough to slice through the room's noise. I obeyed, balancing a tray laden with plates. My arms ached as I stepped forward, careful, steady. And then, perhaps because my hands trembled, perhaps because exhaustion had dulled my grip, one plate slipped, tumbled to the floor, and shattered. The room went still, all eyes on me. Before I could kneel to clean it, Ethan was on his feet, his face twisted with rage, though I could see the glint of satisfaction beneath it. This was what he wanted. An opportunity. His hand struck me across the face, harder than before, and the sound echoed in the silence of the room. Gasps rose, but no one moved. Not one soul spoke. I stood there, my cheek burning, tears gathering but refusing to fall, my hands clenched at my sides. The humiliation was worse than the pain. To be stripped of dignity, not in secret, but in front of a room full of people who chose to look away. And there, across the table, sat Tom, my husband. His eyes locked on his plate, his fork unmoving. He couldn't even bear to look at me. That night I lay awake long after the guests had gone, staring into the darkness, the sting of the slap burning more deeply in my heart than on my skin. I thought of running, of leaving the house in the middle of the night, barefoot if I had to, and never coming back. But where would I go? My parents were far, and even if I reached them, Ethan's shadow was long. He would drag me back or worse, destroy what little pride they still held for me. So, I stayed. Then came the winter night. Snow had been falling since morning, blanketing the world in a heavy silence. By evening, the cold had seeped into the walls, despite the fires burning in the hearths. I was folding laundry when Ethan's voice cut across the hallway. "The well's running low. Fetch more water." I froze. "Now?" I asked before I could stop myself. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Did I stutter? It was midnight. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. The well stood at the far edge of the property, past the garden, near the bare trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. I pulled my shawl tightly around my shoulders and carried the heavy pail through the snow. My boots sank deep with every step, the icy wind slicing through fabric, stinging my face. By the time I reached the well, my fingers were numb. I lowered the bucket, the rope creaking, my breath clouding the air. As I hauled the water up, the weight pulled hard against my raw palms. The rope slipped once, burning my skin. The bucket tipped, splashing icy water across my skirt. My teeth chattered as I steadied it, forcing myself to keep moving. On the way back, the snow was deeper, the wind fiercer. My legs trembled under the weight of the pail. My body screamed for rest, but I pushed forward, step by agonizing step. Halfway across the yard, my foot caught on a hidden stone beneath the snow. I stumbled, the pail crashing down, water spilling across the frozen ground. My hands tore against the ice as I fell, pain shooting through me. For a moment I lay there, the cold biting into my skin, my breath ragged. I wanted to close my eyes and let the night swallow me, but somewhere inside a voice rose, quiet, trembling but insistent. "Get up! You're not broken yet." With shaking arms, I pushed myself upright. Blood dripped from a cut on my palm. My shawl hung heavy with ice. Still, I lifted the pail, trudged back to the well, filled it again. And this time, though my body cried in protest, I made it all the way back to the house. When I staggered through the kitchen door, Ethan was waiting. He smirked, glanced at the water, and walked away without a word. To him it was nothing. To me it was everything. Proof that even when he tried to break me, I endured. Later that night, as I sat by the fire warming my frozen hands, a whisper brushed my ear. "You're stronger than he thinks." I turned, startled. It was Margaret, the oldest servant in the house, her face lined with years of quiet suffering. She knelt beside me, gently wrapping my wounded hands with strips of cloth she must have torn from her own apron. "Don't let him convince you you're weak," she murmured. "He fears women who endure. That's why he tries so hard to crush you." Her words sank into me like medicine. For weeks I had felt alone, unseen, abandoned even by my own husband. But here was someone who noticed, someone who cared enough to speak. Margaret leaned closer, her eyes glinting with quiet defiance. "I'll help you. When he tries to starve you, I'll see that you eat. When he wounds you, I'll see that you heal. You are not alone, child. Remember that." For the first time since I had entered that house, I felt a flicker of warmth that no winter could freeze. Not hope, not yet, but the beginning of it, the whisper of strength waiting to grow. The breaking point had not shattered me. It had shown me that cracks, once formed, could let the light in. The days that followed the winter night were different. Not because Ethan changed. No, his cruelty remained steady as the turning of the seasons. But because something inside me had shifted. I had faced the snow, the biting cold, the weight of water heavier than my body could bear. And still I returned. I had endured. That knowledge became a secret ember inside me, a warmth I carried even when the house felt colder than the frost outside. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. He fears women who endure. So I began to endure differently, not as a victim, but as a quiet resistor. When Ethan mocked me, I no longer rushed to defend myself. I kept my voice calm, my answers steady, as if his insults were nothing but wind blowing against a mountain. He expected me to flinch, to cower, to break, but I gave him stillness instead. When he ordered me to fetch water late at night, I did it, but I walked slowly, deliberately, as though I was not obeying him but choosing my own pace. Each small act was invisible to others, but to me, it was a reclaiming of something he had stolen. My dignity, Margaret noticed. Sometimes she would catch my eye across the kitchen and give the smallest nod, as if to say, "Yes, child, you are learning, but endurance does not go unanswered." Ethan sensed it, even if he could not name it. My silence, once born of fear, had changed. Now it was something else. Something he could not quite control. And that drove him to escalate. One evening he found me in the hallway. A storm raged outside, thunder cracking against the night sky. But the storm in his eyes was fiercer. "You think you can defy me with your silence?" he hissed, stepping closer. "You think I don't see it? That stubbornness in your face?" I said nothing, my hands folded before me. Inside my heart pounded, but outwardly I stood still. His rage exploded. He ordered me to kneel on the wooden floor, straight-backed, my arms raised with a heavy log balanced across them. "Stay until I say," he barked. The minutes dragged like hours. My arms shook, my shoulders screamed in pain, but I refused to collapse. Sweat dripped down my back, tears blurred my vision. Yet I held steady. Every time the log threatened to slip, I pushed upward again, whispering silently, "You will not win, not this time." When at last he allowed me to stop, I lowered the log and rose on trembling legs. My cheeks were wet with tears, but my eyes were steady. He stared at me, breathing hard, as if he had expected to see me broken. Instead, he saw me standing. His face twisted with frustration, and he turned away without another word. That night, Tom came into our room while I sat at the window, staring out at the lightning flickering across the fields. He paused in the doorway, watching me. I heard what he did. He whispered. I did not answer. Silence had become my shield. Tom stepped closer, his face pale, his voice tight. "How do you do it? How do you stand there and take it? Anyone else would have given in by now." I turned to him then, meeting his eyes. For the first time, I let him see the fire inside me. Because if I bow, I am no longer myself. And I will not lose who I am. Not to him. Not to anyone. Tom's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked away, ashamed, as though the weight of my strength revealed the depth of his weakness. But something shifted in him that night. I could see it. The way he lingered a little longer in the room. The way his gaze followed me with a new heaviness. For the first time, perhaps, he saw me not as a helpless bride to be pitied, but as a woman carrying more courage than he had ever dared to summon. From then on, Ethan's screams seemed to echo differently. When he raised his voice at me, Tom no longer sat so comfortably in silence. He fidgeted. He clenched his fists. He looked away, but not with indifference. With shame. The house itself seemed to sense the change. Margaret's eyes glimmered with pride when she passed me bread in the kitchen. Even the younger cousins, once eager to laugh at Ethan's cruelty, began to fall quiet when he berated me. Something unseen was stirring in the air. Not rebellion, not yet, but the first whispers of it. And though I was still trapped in that house, I knew this. Courage had awakened. It lived in me now, unshakable, unyielding. Ethan could strike, he could command, he could humiliate. But he could not touch the fire inside me. I was no longer only enduring, I was preparing. The tide of a river changes slowly at first, almost invisible to the eye. but once it turns, nothing can stop its pull. That was how change entered the Whitaker house. Margaret was the one who lit the spark. She had worked in that household longer than anyone, her wrinkled hands bearing the memory of decades of quiet service. People overlooked her, thinking age had made her invisible. But invisibility has its power. She heard what others whispered, saw what others hid. One evening, as I scrubbed the kitchen floor, Margaret knelt beside me. Her voice dropped to a hush. "You should know something," she murmured. "Your husband's brother, Ethan, he's been stealing. Grain from the villagers, coins from the rents, the very people who trust this house. He robs them blind." I froze, the rag in my hand dripping water onto the tiles. "He thinks himself untouchable," she continued. "But word is spreading, slowly, but it is. When the villagers gather their courage, they'll rise against him. And when they do, you must stand firm, not just for yourself, but for every soul he's trampled." Her eyes held mine, fierce and unblinking. In that moment, Margaret was no longer just a servant. She was a sentinel, carrying wisdom born of pain. Days passed, and I began to notice the shift. Whispers reached the house. Whispers of missing grain, of families cheated. Farmers spoke of Ethan's greed with bitterness, their voices rising louder with each passing week. For the first time, the cracks in his untouchable armor began to show. And then came the day my silence broke. It was late afternoon. The sun slanted through the windows, painting the parlor in golden light. I was setting a tray on the table when Ethan stormed in, his face twisted with rage. He had heard the whispers, no doubt. The villagers questioning him, challenging his name. And as always, he needed someone to bear the brunt of his fury. "You," he snarled, pointing at me. "This is your doing. Your weakness infects this house. You shame us with your clumsiness, your stubborn eyes." He stepped closer, towering above me. I could smell the wine on his breath, sharp and bitter. "Do you hear me?" he shouted, his hand rising. "You will learn your place, or I'll—" But before his hand could fall, I did something I had never dared before. I reached up and caught his wrist. Gasps filled the room. Margaret, standing in the doorway, froze. Even Tom, who had entered behind his brother, stopped short, his eyes wide with shock. I did not strike him. I did not shout. I simply held his wrist, firmly, my gaze locked with his. My hand shook, but my eyes did not. "No more," I said softly. It was not loud, but it was enough. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling, final and undeniable. Ethan's face contorted, torn between fury and disbelief. He tried to pull his arm free, but I held on, not with strength of muscle, but with the strength of every humiliation, every slap, every cold night I had endured. At last he ripped his hand back and stumbled a step away, his breath ragged. For the first time I saw fear flicker in his eyes. Not fear of me as a person, but fear of what I represented. Resistance, defiance, the one thing tyrants cannot control. The room remained silent, the air thick with shock. Tom's face was pale, but his gaze met mine, and in it, I saw something new. Not shame, not pity, respect. That night, whispers spread through the house faster than any flame. Servants spoke of the moment in hushed voices, how the young bride had stood against the landlord's son, how she had caught his hand and looked him in the eye. Some called me reckless, others called me brave. But the word that echoed most was simple, unstoppable. And outside those walls, in the village, the whispers grew louder still. The fall of a tyrant never comes quietly. It arrives like a storm that has long gathered in silence, sudden and unstoppable. It was a gray morning when the rumble began. At first, only voices drifting from the road beyond the gate. Then footsteps, many footsteps. By the time the household peered from the windows, the yard was full. Farmers, tenants, villagers, men with calloused hands, women with babies at their hips, children clinging to skirts. They had come for Ethan. Their voices rose in unison, bitter with anger, thick with years of being wronged. He steals from us. He bleeds us dry while he feasts. We will not bow to him any longer. Inside the house, panic stirred. Servants whispered, darting from window to window. Aunt Claire wrung her hands. Mrs. Whittaker paled, her lips trembling. And Ethan stormed through the halls, his face flushed crimson, shouting for silence, for order, for obedience. But outside, no one obeyed. I stood in the corridor, my heart pounding as the chants shook the very walls. For the first time, Ethan's voice carried no weight. His threats were drowned out by the roar of people who had found their courage. Then Tom stepped forward, my husband, the man who had so long been silent, bound by fear. I watched him enter the parlor where Ethan paced like a caged wolf, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. "Brother," Tom said, his voice low but steady, "it's over." Ethan spun on him, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "You," he spat. "You dare stand against me? After everything I've given you?" Tom's face twisted, years of shame written in the lines around his eyes. "You gave me nothing but chains. You've humiliated my wife, terrorized this house, stolen from those who trusted us. I will not be silent anymore." For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, and then, as if pulled by some unseen thread, Tom moved. He stepped to my side. His hand did not touch mine, not yet, but the space between us shifted. For the first time since I entered that house, he stood with me, not apart. Ethan's face contorted with fury. He raised his hand as if to strike me again, to reassert the rule he had always believed unshakable. But this time, when his hand rose, mine did not tremble. I stood tall, eyes fixed on his, the fire within me burning brighter than his rage. And something remarkable happened. He faltered. His hand hung in the air, suspended, as though weighed down by the eyes not just of me, but of everyone. Tom, Margaret, the servants peering from doorways, the villagers chanting beyond the gates. For the first time, he was alone. The chants outside swelled, pressing against the walls. "Justice! Justice!" Ethan's hand dropped. His shoulders sagged, his power bleeding away like water from a cracked vessel. He turned, searching for support among his family, his servants, his brother. But where once he had ruled, now he found only silence. And in that silence, I spoke. My voice was steady, quiet, but it carried more weight than his shouting ever had. "You cannot take my dignity, because it was never yours to give." The words rang out, final and undeniable. Ethan's face drained of color. He stumbled back a step, then another, as though my calm was more unbearable than any defiance. By the time the villagers forced open the gates and stormed the courtyard, Ethan was already broken, not by fists, not by chains, but by the truth he could no longer deny. He had ruled through fear, and fear once shattered cannot be rebuilt. I stood at the window, the chants echoing, Tom beside me at last, and in that moment, I realized what I had been fighting for all along. Not revenge, not victory, but the simple, unshakable truth. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. And now, years later, as I sit in my quiet chair, telling this story to you, I can still hear the echoes of that day, the voices of the villagers rising together, the silence of a tyrant who realized his reign had ended, the sound of my own heart beating steady, no longer with fear but with freedom. I was young then, far younger than you might imagine, and the world seemed so much larger, its shadows so much darker. I thought I was powerless, a servant in my own home, beaten down by a man who believed he owned me. But I learned something that has stayed with me all my life. There is a strength in the human spirit that no hand can crush, no voice can silence, no chain can bind. Ethan tried to take everything from me, my pride, my safety, my joy. And for a time I let myself believe he had succeeded. But he never truly held those things. Because dignity, child, dignity lives within us. It is not handed out by the powerful. It is not gifted by husbands or brothers or landlords. It is ours from the moment we draw breath. That day, when the village stood and my husband finally found his voice, I found mine too. And once it was found, it could never again be lost. Do not think, though, that life became a fairy tale after. The scars remained, not only on my skin, but in the quiet corners of memory. Ethan was gone, but the world still had its cruelties, its injustices. I carried burdens still, yet I carried them differently, no longer bowed, no longer broken, and in time I discovered something else, that out of suffering can come compassion, out of wounds can come wisdom, out of silence can come a voice strong enough to guide others. So when you sit here listening to me now, I do not tell you this tale to fill you with sorrow. I tell it to remind you that no matter where you come from, no matter how heavy the hand that presses on your back, you are not less. You are not owned. You are not powerless. I tell you this so that you may carry your head high when the world tries to make you bow, so that you may walk forward even when the path is rough, so that you may never, ever forget. Dignity is not given. It is claimed. And one day, when you face your own storm, and you will in some form or another, I pray you remember my story. I pray you remember that even a frightened young bride, beaten and silenced, could rise and say, "Enough." If I could find that courage then, you can find it now. Because strength, my dear, strength is not the absence of fear. It is standing anyway. And with that, I leave you my story. Not as a burden, but as a gift. Carry it. Let it remind you. And when the moment comes, claim your dignity too.